Okay, now that you've read chapter 6, the critical thing here about how we go about thinking about ourselves as analysts is having a sense and understanding about the tools, the instruments, right? The structure that it's really part of a policy in a more traditional way, right? I want to make sure that we get and understand this week too, in relationship to the kind of traditional instruments and ways in which policy functions, as well as the ways people use those instruments. So you're going to see a little bit later on here in a presentation that I offer that what I try to do is kind of place this issue of why policy matters in relationship to the work of three individuals. If you remember the week before, I offer you two videos where we have two past students kind of framing issues that are important to them and what they're doing, and the kind of relationship to their to policy thinking, right? To policy theory, which is gonna come on week of week 3. So we're gonna kind of work our way toward chapter 2, which kind of thinks about all these theories. But we've been reading things, right? We read critical policy analysis. We read the piece by Ryan Shaw talking about multiple streams and coalition building, right? So we're starting to make sense of how these things work. And now in the presentation, you're going to see 3 students thinking about that process as well. Chapter 6, try to articulate some of these elements in intangible terms, right? In terms that are more traditional to policy. So again, I highlight the idea of hard and soft policies that you've read about from Patrick Jonas's piece, right? So the idea that the recommendation, campaigns, action plans are a softer way to, for instance, to get at where we want to be, right? Later on in the course, we're going to talk about the behavior and the psychological aspects of policy. Oftentimes, when people talk about policy, they talk about something that's very rational, that's very precise, that's very specific. And while some of the instruments, some of the structures that Chapter 6 presents hint into that and point into this, there's so much about policy that is really that is emotional, right? That matters to people in certain ways, and the way that gets communicated, presented, represented, framed, at times helps. At times is contradictory to this. In the book, I talk at some point about the case of Mr. Rogers going to Congress. If you're not old enough to remember Mr. Rogers, you can Google Mr. Rogers, and it's a wonderful program on public television that really captivated the manner in which childhood mattered, and the relations between the kind of child's world and the environment in many, many ways similar to this kind of practice, right? And I highlight a story, and there's a documentary of Mr. Rogers speaking about the importance of maintaining public resources, public funding for television that can be educational, that in any kind of media environment that can be educational. And we know this is timely again, right, where we are. So part of what we are reading here is the kind of the nitty-gritty that can be a little, stale or boring. But when you start thinking about that there is, a policy that is hard, but there's also all these other soft ways, right, that are much more about convincing, about inducing, about, bringing coalition of people in, right? Remember again the Ryan Shaw piece that you've read. This makes a difference, right? And so we see the hardened elements, for instance, of policy, even when policy it's not stated, right? The practice of it can be very, very meaningful. And I use an example on page 130 about redlining, how redlining was not a written policy, right? If you've seen the movie A Few Good Men, the Jack Nicholson and Tom Cruise, and Jack Nicholson has the famous line, "You can't handle the truth." The whole kind of trial discussion was about something that was a policy, but it was not written in that book. If you've never seen the book, the movie, you should see it. And if you remember that part, you know that they're talking about Code Red, and that Code Red was never written anywhere, and yet everybody knew about it, right? These are the kinds of things that also happen, for instance, in redlining. It was never written anywhere for anybody to see, but we had decades of people of color being discriminated in terms of where they could buy and get mortgages for, and this had created an incredible impact on the realities of many people throughout this country, from in the kind of early 30s all the way to the 70s and 80s. So the chapter talks about, for instance, the questions of de facto and hidden policies. We're talking go into instruments as well, the kind of mandates, the inducements, how do we get people to do that, capacity building, and system changing, right? And the goal here is for you to think about the ways in which there's really multiple ways to do something, right? At times they kind of intersect. At times people focus and work on a particular issue. At times we should be thinking about, how do I, for instance, build my own capacity, right? I mean, this course is trying to get you to think about this issue and how that matters, policy and policy practice, as a way of building capacity for the work that you're going to do in the schools and higher education and in non-governmental organizations, right? We think about that also in terms of instruments and kind of and where and how they function within particular institutions, right? An example there on page 34 is how accreditation functions, right? All higher education functions around accreditation. And that has a really significant impact on how organizations function. But together with that, there's also procedural instruments, right? There's ways of going about, right? Congress has ways and means, for instance, to which organize the budgetary structure and deliverance, about processes, right? Legislation gets passed, and then a bunch of other people end up engaging in rulemaking, which is really the nitty-gritty of the larger piece, right? We have also information-based instruments, right? Kind of the ways in which policy gets disseminated and the ways in which we make people aware of certain things, right? If you ever heard, campaigns about, for instance, not starting fires and how to behave in public parks, right? Well, this is policy in action, right? This is information-based kind of instruments of policy. How do we get people and change their minds, right? People, 40 years ago didn't really think or understood or care to a certain extent, right, of the importance of seatbelts, right? And that, shifted over time through these kinds of information-based instruments of policy. Same thing with cigarettes, right? So the ways in which we eat, kind of habits, when jogging came along and people were kind of behaving in a very, very different way, right, on the streets in public. That was very early on, when the idea of running, right, was just nonsense, right? And so we engage with these kinds of policy instruments all the time, and they live all around us, and we just kind of don't pay attention to them. But these are really significant instruments. And then we have tools, right? We have specific ways and specific spaces, right? So, for instance, when people use white and green papers, when they want to advocate for something, when they want to contextualize. If you go to Washington, think tanks, right, from the American Enterprise or to Brookings or to Cato, any of these think tanks are there to functioning as a kind of an arm, right, of influence, right, of lobbying. But they themselves are constantly producing all kinds of things like white and green papers. The OECD, if you've never heard of OECD, has a huge impact. The PISA, task scores and all that comes from OECD. If you look at OECD and education, you find tons and tons and tons of ways in which they use particular, tools of policy, from surveys to polling to briefings, right? And you're going to see on page 138 and 39, you saw it, that the way in which we're functioning and organizing the final project is connected to what I have here in the book of a policy brief, right? And I have had you already read, and we're going to read more of examples of this and what they do and what they try to communicate, right? General research, of course, is a big part of policy kind of structuring. And then what I try to do is kind of move this into the personal as well, right? So how do we think about leadership and how leadership can benefit from a kind of a policy that is not just about know-how and about knowing how to use these instruments and being literate with them, but it's also about thinking relationally, right? So on page 144, for instance, I show and talked about the idea of the classroom, the school, and the field in relationship to the notions of technology, policies around technology, which are constantly being adopted and changed, right? When ChatGPT first came around a year and a half or so or two ago, the New York public schools tried to ban that, right? And immediately that policy was perceived to be untenable, right? And so we change, we adapt, we kind of reconfigure. 10 years ago, 12, 15 years ago, the idea of iPad for students, computers in the classroom were really key. Today, given social media, there's a growing body of states and advocates trying to ban, cell phones from classrooms. So these are all kinds of things that come with policy, and then with policies that are connected to restraint and punishment and inducements, right? All those kinds of things. We live through this processes all the time. If you read the chapter and you start thinking about how often you are in contact with a policy tool, with a policy instrument, how you use it in your own classroom, in your own work environment, how you're framed and organized, and how jobs are delineated through some of these things, right? Who gets to do what, to have a say, to be a part, to make decisions. All these are around these notions. This is the soup, right, that is part of life and work within institutions and organizations. So hopefully it's helpful, right? So when you see this just in the paper, it looks dry, but hopefully the conversation here is, in fact, this is all around us. And it behooves us to be able to understand that and to be able to be an actor in this, right? To have some say and to know how to use it to our own benefits, to the benefit of our students, our programs, and so forth. Okay, take care.